When we talk about body cavities, we have to remember that there are membranes within them. And specifically, these types of membranes are wet membranes, and they are called serous membranes because they produce a fluid called serous fluid. And they're primarily around three main cavities, and they're subdivided into two different surfaces, one being the visceral layer, which is in direct contact with the external surface of the organ. When we talk about organs, we sometimes refer to them as the viscera. Now, superficial to that layer is the parietal layer, and you should know what superficial means now, closer to the external part of the body. But when we talk about layers, remember it's visceral or it's deep versus superficial. So the more superficial layer is going to be the parietal layer. The deeper layer is going to be the visceral layer. And between that is where serous fluid is actually produced. The function of the serous fluid is that it helps reduce the friction when moving the organs. One example being the heart, one being the lungs, and one being the pericardium. So remember in the thoracic cavity, you learned in the last video that there is the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart. There's a serous membrane around the heart. The one directly in contact with the heart is called the visceral pericardium. Then there's another membrane, another serous membrane, which is superficial to that called the parietal pericardium. And that's in the pericardial cavity. Now, including the heart and the region superior to the heart is a cavity called the mediastinum. It's a median space. Notice median is not the same thing as medial. So that's important for you to remember. The mediastinum contains the heart. Also, superior to the heart or directly on top of the heart is the thymus. Posterior to the heart would be the trachea, the windpipe. Posterior to that is the esophagus, part of the digestive system, and some of those major vessels that I mentioned, being the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. We call these great vessels because they are coming out of the heart. For the lungs, we also have a serous membrane. The cavity where the lungs are found is called the pleural cavity. The serous membrane directly on top of the heart is called the visceral pleura, and the ones that is superficial to that would be the parietal pleura. Now, to give you an example of this, I want you to imagine if you put your fist inside of a balloon. There's going to be a part of the balloon which is touching your fist. So imagine that your fist is the organ, and the membrane touching your fist, which would be the organ, would be the visceral membrane. And then the one that is superficial to that would be the parietal serous membrane. So again, this is the parietal serous membrane, and this would be where the visceral serous membrane would be. So in the body, this is what we see. So an example of this for the heart, you can see the membrane directly touching the heart is called the visceral pericardium. Superficial to that is the parietal pericardium, and the space between those two membranes is called the pericardial cavity. And there we find serous fluid, which helps to reduce the friction when the heart expands and contracts with each heartbeat. Serous membranes also in the thoracic cavity would be, of course, around the lungs. And we know that the cavity surrounding the lungs is the pleural cavity. So the membrane touching the lungs is the visceral pleura. Superficial to that would be the parietal pleura. And in between the two membranes, again, is the pleural cavity, which produces serous fluid. So just as a reminder, both of these cavities, the pericardial cavity and the pleural cavity, are going to be superficial to the diaphragm, which is a muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the last of these serous membranes would be around the peritoneum. The peritoneum is a term for membranes around abdominal organs. And again, the same thing applies. There's going to be a membrane directly touching those abdominal organs called the visceral peritoneum. Then superficial to that would be the parietal peritoneum. And then between that is the peritoneal cavity. So this is what we can see here. This is a mid-sagittal section of the peritoneum. Here's the diaphragm, which is what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. The visceral peritoneum is actually directly touching most of the intestines, specifically the small intestine, the also in this area posterior to this would be the pancreas. Notice that the stomach is surrounded by the visceral peritoneum as well, and the large intestine also. And this specific part of the large intestine, if you're curious, is the transverse colon. You don't need to know the parts of the large intestine right now, but you do need to know that they are part of the digestive system. So then there's a peritoneal space, and superficial to that membrane is the parietal peritoneum. So the next slide is on abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants. So there's two different ways to break up the abdominal pelvic region. The most common in medicine tends to be the quadrants, but we also need to know the abdominal pelvic regions. The abdominal pelvic regions, I like to think of it as the tic-tac-toe board. So if you can start with a blank sheet of paper like this, you put the X right in the middle first, and that would be the umbilical region, which is where the navel would be. There is where we find the majority of the small intestine. Then we can use some directional terms to relate the other abdominal pelvic regions to each other. Directly superior to the umbilical region is the epigastric region. And our prefix here, epi, means on top of. Gastric means stomach. And that's predominantly where the stomach is found. The one that's directly inferior to the umbilical region is the hypogastric. And again, you can look at the prefix and the suffix here. Hypo is below, and gastric means stomach. Then we have the lumbar regions. Those are kind of easier because it's the lower back. And the important thing that you want to understand when you're looking at an anatomical model or you're considering your patient, for example, your right is their left and vice versa. So that means that your right is going to be their left. They're facing you. So your left will be their right. So this would be the right lumbar and the left lumbar. Inferior to that, we have the iliac regions. There's a part of the hip bone that you're going to be learning later in the semester called the ilium and parts of that ilium. And then finally, we have the hypochondriac. And when you look at chondro, that has to do with cartilage. So hopefully that will help you remember where these are located at. They're below the cartilage that connects the ribs to the sternum. So this would be the right hypochondriac, and this would be the left hypochondriac. And then you need to know the organs that we find in them. So here you can see the umbilical region has predominantly the small intestine. There's a little bit of the large intestine. Here's the epigastric with mostly the stomach, but also a majority of the liver sitting on top of it. But the bulk of your liver tends to be on your right hypochondriac side. In the hypogastric region is the majority of the pelvic regions, like the urinary bladder. And then in the right lumbar and left lumbar, we have predominantly the large intestine.